Okay, I'll begin this by saying that I don't think the fifth edition Dungeon Master's Guide is the greatest Dungeon Master's Guide that has ever been written.
Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, but I'm not alone. I have some guests with me. We're going to talk about the Dungeon Master Guide, but we'll get to that in a second. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Mark, and with my other pals, Gonzo and sometimes Logan, we are Dungeon Class. We have a YouTube channel where we talk about D&D 5e and mostly how to have more fun and a lot of family kind of talk on there and stuff. But we're all about the fun, not all those pesky rules and such.
Josiah, what about yourself? Would you like to tell everybody about yourself?
Yeah, my name is DungeonDad. My YouTube channel is pretty rad. Subscribe or I'll be sad. It's really not that bad.
Wow.
End scene.
Okay, AJ, let's see you up that one. Would you like to tell everybody, can you make it rhyme?
I'm not even going to attempt a rap battle against Josiah. He's the master. We all know this. Mind you, I challenge anybody to enter the worlds of narrative fiction that you can find on my channel, which you can find as AJ Pickett on YouTube. I'm also available on Subscribestar, Patreon, and various other social medias, including Facebook groups where you can go for lots of juicy lore information. If you look up Sages of Ravenloft or Forgotten Realms or Spelljammer, you'll find us. And it's a good place to get away from drama.
Is the Dungeon Master Guide for Dungeons and Dragons 5e obsolete? Why, if it is, or why not, is the Dungeon Master Guide obsolete? And we're going to open it up because I can see AJ's head shaking away there. So we're going to start with Mark, because then we're going to get all of the interesting reactions from AJ and hopefully from somebody else as we go. So Mark, what do you think?
Honestly, I don't think it's obsolete because here's my thing. So I think it's necessary and it's part of a 3-step process that I call the growth of a dungeon master. So we kind of on our channel, we talk a lot about how to start. Yeah, how to start. And basically, we think one of the easiest ways is like the essentials kit or even a pre-made adventure. Is you kind of have a template of how things go and you kind of learn, okay, this kind of thing that's in a room, this is the kind of things I roll for, those kind of things. So you start with a pre-made adventure, and then the Dungeon Master's Guide kind of fills in the middle where you can start to look at, okay, this is how adventures put together. These are the kind of things I need in an adventure and all those kind of things. And then the next step is something like Sly Flourish, Lazy Dungeon Master, which is where you just are taking the meat of everything, just the gist of everything. You can whip together something pretty quickly. You don't have to go through all those steps in the Dungeon Master Guide, and you're more free to kind of be a lot more open and whip things up more quickly and more efficiently. So I kind of think the Dungeon Master Guide is still, it's definitely valid and something a person needs. Perhaps later in their Dungeon Master career, they don't need it as much, but I do think it's definitely not obsolete.
What about you, Josiah? What do you think in terms of the Dungeon Master Guide?
Yeah, I think that the Dungeon Master Guide is quintessentially important if you're a dumb baby. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding. I would get mine out to show it while I'm talking about this, but my computer monitor has been resting on top of it for the past 3 years. The Dungeon Masters, that's true. The Dungeon Masters Guide, I agree with what Mark just said. I'm not actually coming in swinging that hard. The Dungeon Masters Guide, I think, is very important if you are a new DM for sure. For everything that Mark just said. Like, I'm not going to repeat all of that. I just straight up agree with you. That said, I do think that it is something that you outgrow as you become acquainted with the rules and stuff. I do still use the treasure tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I think that's the only thing I really reference it for still. Also, this isn't like even a knock on the book. It's just a fact is that with the internet, like most of the stuff that we would look up in the book before is just easily accessible, right? You'd be like, if you have a question about how something interacts, like a spell interacts with an ability, you Google it and there's a tweet from Chris Perkins or something explaining what is true or not true about that situation, right? I don't think that's a knock on the book. It's just a fact of reality. You know, like there was definitely a time where I couldn't just bust out my smartphone in the year 2000 and look up anything I needed to find from the 3.5 or 3.0 Dungeon Master's Guide, right? So I think that it seems obsolete because of the internet, but I do think at the end of the day, there is information in there that's important. Most important, especially if you're still acquainting yourself with the rule. One thing I will say, however, and this is just a general comment, like Wizards of the Coast, don't at me. It's insane that it's 3 books. Why is there a monster manual, a player's handbook, and a dungeon master's guide? I think that that's just always been how it has been in the past. The dungeon master's guide and the player's handbook should be a book. It should just, yeah, well, that's the real reason, right? Is because money. If you can charge $60 a pop for your books, like, of course they're going to make 3 of them because that's how it's always been. But I do think it's wild that it's a separate book from the player's handbook. They do put some stuff in there for sure. I just feel like it doesn't warrant being a completely separate product.
So what do you think of the Dungeon Master Guide, AJ?
Okay, I'll begin this by saying that I don't think the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide is the greatest Dungeon Master's Guide that has ever been written. That was the Pathfinder Dungeon Mastery book for 1st edition Pathfinder. That was the greatest Dungeon Master Guide I had read up until that point, and I actually referred to it more often than I referred to my 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. What I like to look at it is as it's the DLC content. It's okay, you've bought your player's handbook, you've got vanilla D&D in your hand. The Dungeon Master's Guide is all the extra shit. So you've kicked down the dungeon doors, you've talked to the dark patron in the corner of the tavern, you've fought your fire beetles in the cellar and the giant rats, and you've finally gotten up to the point where you've killed the Orcus. Well, first of all, you can't really get there unless you've got the Dungeon Master's Guide to tell you what the outer planes are. Or you can't really run something off the cuff like a Spelljammer campaign, which the Dungeon Master Guide gives you all the tools for, by the way, unless you've got that guidebook to give you some basic connectivity between the legacy of dungeon mastering as it was and where it is today. It used to be that the Dungeon Master's Guide was a grab bag of like, how exactly long does it take for a halfling to dig through concrete? How about weathered concrete? So the Dungeon Master's Guide used to be like, oh, there is actually something on that. Holy shit. These days, it's more like, what sort of problem players can you expect at your table? Or, so you want to run a game in the far future. How can you handle that as easily as possible? So it's getting more towards the lines of a gazetteer or an expansion on lore and things like that, and allows you to bring in some odd elements to your game which otherwise would not be present in just the monster manual or the player's handbook. The player's handbook doesn't really have all that lore stuff in there. So I'm going to argue that the Dungeon Master's Guide needs to exist. It's definitely going to carry on evolving. And I think 5th edition, definitely we've seen a lot of the money grab elements of it where you are going to have an edition where I keep saying that we're not going to see a 6th edition until we see a rules compendium book that's printed for 5th edition, which has got all the stuff from Modern Canons and Volo's Guide. When you see that, that's the blood in the water of like, oh, that's the official death of an edition is when they come out with a rules compendium. It's like PewDiePie has clapped his hands on that meme. It's time to move on to the next one.
So I'm going to go with, I think the Dungeon Master's Guide is obsolete. And I got a couple of reasons because I did a video on it. I'm going to explain why I think this. And that is, I think we need to have a Dungeon Master Guide, and I think we need to have a book that's printed, because not everybody around the world has the kind of access to the internet that we do, whether it be the devices that we're using. Okay, some places that are just too expensive. People just don't have the income, but they're still playing Dungeons and Dragons. And they might be buying books that are secondhand or passed down, or they fell off the back of a truck or whatever it is. I mean, they're playing Dungeons and Dragons, so that we need to have a physical book. But I think in this time and age, Wizards of the Coast is working against the digital age. And when you think about the number of online tools, websites, apps on your phone, things that just do it better than the Dungeon Master Guide, quite often, if you get enough apps, you can get access to a lot of the tools that we want as a Dungeon Master and use better than the Dungeon Master Guide can do. But there's another problem, I think, with the Dungeon Master Guide. And I was looking through that and I noticed that there was a lot of reprinted material in the Dungeon Master Guide. When I looked at older versions of the Dungeon Master Guide, the layout was almost identical. And you might say, well, okay, the layout's identical because they did it right the first time round. Wizards of the Coast has actually made 6 Dungeon Master Guides. One for version 3, one for version 3.5, 2 for version 4. I use those ones more than anything else. And I also agree, AJ, that the Pathfinder, the first one, their book was excellent. Okay, it was very, very good. And then they also put out a D&D Essentials during Dungeons & Dragons 4E, and that had a Dungeon Master Guide as well. And now we have the 5th ed edition. So by now, Wizards of the Coast should be just like experts at this. And there is too much reprinted material. And in some cases, important stuff like player style. They didn't even put everything in there. They took part of it and they left out other aspects that they did really well in other books, and they didn't put it into this book. Things like magic items. I know a lot of people complain about magic items taking up too much of the Dungeon Master Guide, right? But yet we had them in version 3.5, and it took about as much space as back then. I think that is one of the things I thought was interesting when I did a poll on my channel, that the magic item section, not because Dungeon Masters really wanted it, but they reference that part of the book more than anything else. It does feel like a poor attempt at a Dungeon Master Guide that's more suitable for a beginner Dungeon Master because they don't know any better, because they haven't seen any of the other stuff that's been put out by third party or by Wizards of the Coast over the years. And they did exclude a lot of vital information. And I thought it was interesting, AJ, that you said that it only explains how to deal with problem players. And actually there was better information in the 4E book on dealing with problem players or problem behavior.
I was going by the assumption that most people haven't played 4th edition or have no interest in it. So
yeah,
skip.
Yeah, skip. Yeah. But I mean, this is half the reason why we've got so many videos. We've got so many videos on YouTube that, talking about how to deal with making, Dungeon Masters making mistakes, problem players. I hate these videos so much they're the worst thing under the sun. I don't like them at all. And
why would you need a Dungeon Master's Guide when you've got 50,000 videos? I agree with you that I don't think D&D should ever be completely not analog. Like I won't buy a video game where you have to be connected to the internet in order to play it.
Yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons should never be a game where it's wholly reliant on digital tools.
I think that as a result of what they've done, that they really should have made this book a combination of two. And they kind of did that. They did an online PDF of the Dungeon Master Guide that had part of the tools in there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they didn't go far enough, because a lot of the material that they had done a really good job in the past, they left out. And it wasn't on the online tool or PDF that you could download for free. And it wasn't in the Dungeon Master's Guide. As a result, people don't look for the answers in the Dungeon Master Guide for 5e. They go and look for it somewhere else. And I'm like, well, why is that happening? That shouldn't be happening. These guys have been playing for so long. They probably play more games than we ever do. They know the answers to this stuff. So I kind of feel like, even if you don't consider it obsolete, it is a poor quality Dungeon Master Guide.
There's also been a lot of stuff from the Dungeon Master's Guide that's had to been like they put out erratas and like things that explain it better, because there's tons of stuff in it that they're just like, oh, I guess what we meant, like it's the whole rules as written versus rules as intended thing, right? And there's a lot of stuff in the original print Dungeon Master's Guide that has been rectified via Twitter posts, which is very funny.
Well, you can't forget that 5th edition was a paring back of information bloat and
True.
systems bloat and stuff being in there just because it's always been in there, but we don't really know why. So they really looked at the fundamentals of 5th edition, and they did pare it back to the basics. So it was almost like, we're not going to come up with a basic version of D&D anymore. We're just going to make D&D easier access for everyone and not overload them with information right at the start. Of course, that created the dichotomy where we've got experienced players from previous editions who now are using our previous training, you could say, to just fill in the blanks for 5th edition, and we barely even notice it. But when new players are looking for something and the information just isn't there in their current edition, and then you get older players come along and say, well, obviously blah blah blah, it creates a little bit of a us versus them idea that we're explaining the rules to them all the time, when we're really just, we don't understand why they don't know this, because it's don't aware it's not in the edition that we're currently playing. So
there's like an accidental setup for gatekeeping baked into the 5th edition Dungeon Masters
but also
guide.
Behind that drive of getting new people is giving them a reason to start playing Dungeons and Dragons. If you give them the idea that they're the new school players who are taking it from the old school players, it kind of gets that rebellion oomph to it, which has driven a lot of interest.
It's a very interesting discussion there. I mean, ultimately, no matter what I think of the Dungeon Master Guide for Dungeons and Dragons 5e, I don't think it's all Wizards of the Coast's fault. Do you know what I mean? Just because of how technology works now, and just because there is such a vast number of people who've put out like exceptional content and with regard to advice for Dungeon Masters. And clearly, if they had used more pages, they might have been able to get it all there, and it would have done the job better. But I thought it was interesting that there are, on that poll, there were at least 30 to 40% who either never used the Dungeon Master Guide for Dungeons and Dragons 5e, or if they bought it, they never used it. Like they bought a book that they never use at all. I'm like, oh my gosh, really? Thank you guys. That was really interesting. Anyway, now that we've done that question and nobody has lost a limb or a head, or nobody sort of got too upset, we're all good. We're all good. I'm going to say, please let us know down in the comments whether you think the Dungeon Master Guide is obsolete or whether it could have been better, and why or why not. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.
Bring back Thaco.
Oh dear.